Well, good morning, everyone. We're so excited. This is the first time we've had people here for a class in 15, 16 months. So that's very exciting. I was reading, the projections are on the 21st of June that they're going to eliminate masking for everything but hospitals and public transportation, and the that's transportation, the airport's transportation, so buses, planes, trains. So public transportation will still require masks, but pretty much will be almost normal in a couple of more weeks, so that's exciting news. We're starting a new class series, and like we have done in a couple of summers past, we're doing rotating teachers for the summer because it's hard to find, just as it's hard to get all of you here every week, all summer long. It's hard for teachers too. Several of us have travel plans, so we're going to be doing a series. We're going to start with the books of law, and we're just doing I have 40 minutes to cover all of Genesis, so you're laughing, so now you understand. We're going to do some of that, and then we have some topical after that, and we're going to close out the series with some vision classes. And we're going to be looking for input from you as shepherds between now and then as to where do you see Eastside as we come out of pandemic? Where should we be focusing our efforts the most? What things are most important? Where should we be focusing our efforts? That kind of vision for the future. And we'll be looking at that and discussing that. We'll begin our class with a prayer, so if you would bow with me. Father, we are so excited that we're able to be here, and that as we begin a new study of your word, that we can come to understand your will and your purpose for us in our lives in this place and this time. We ask your blessing on those who have ailments, that you would ease their distress, and that you would be with those who are ministering to them. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm going to probably go fairly quickly. We've limited classes to 40 minutes, so we can have a little extra time between class bringing people in. We're going to see how that goes. I'll try and keep an eye on that. So if I cut off some conversation, it's not that I'm trying to be rude or autocratic, but we are going to try and get through the material. So Genesis is the book of beginnings. It starts off in the beginning, right? It's the first book of the Bible, and it talks about lots of beginnings. There's a lot of beginnings in one of the beginnings, obviously, is the beginning of creation. Now, in Genesis, there are, I say 35 chapters, there's 50 chapters. And 10 chapters are devoted to creation. So 20% of Genesis is devoted to creation. So how important must creation be if they took 20% of the book to just talk about creation? 6 chapters cover creation through Adam's family. The first man must be fairly important. In the beginning, we see creation, and we clearly see the power of God. The first part of creation, God is creating from nothing. He speaks things into existence that don't exist. It's not me taking wood and creating this podium. It's me taking nothing that you can see, touch, feel, and make a podium. That's a whole different animal. And he created the heavens and the earth. All of it from nothing. then there's this talk about what's created on the earth. And there's the vision of God is creating how earth is going to run when there wasn't anything. We build all of our things that we build now based upon rules of nature, gravity, hot and cold. None of that existed. That was all God's vision to make it all work. When we do outdoor school with the kids, we talk about how the cycle of nature is God's plan to make the earth self-sustaining. The kids get to learn how God's creation was designed to sustain itself. Pretty powerful things. Patterns from nothing. There are lots of patterns in the world, but there was nothing. But we have a God who sees patterns and sees order, and he likes that. And his creation reflects that. Principles from nothing. There wasn't a principle of gravity, and then there was. It's what, God hung all of the stars in the sky, and the planets around our sun that we are familiar with. And to make it all work, there was this thing called gravity. Didn't exist before. It's so graphic, the power of creation in one of God's attributes, all-powerful. And that is so clearly portrayed in the creation. And we kind of take it for granted. In our 20th century, modern scientific, we can explain everything, but we can't. We can't. But God has an explanation for it. We just might not know it. The other thing is, in Genesis, you have the beginning of law. Now, the first 5 books are historically are the books of law. It's also the books of teaching. They call them the books of law or the books of teaching. It was something that every Jew was supposed to, Jewish male was supposed to memorize. The entire 5 books. It was that important. But in Genesis, we're before the 10 Commandments, and yet we're going to see that there was always law. That's part of that principles that God created, that there are principles, and law is part of those principles. I was in the military, and I was an officer and a leader, and I had to be careful what I said. Because if I said, I think, people acted on it. Or if I said, well, I wonder what, people acted on that. And so I had to be very careful how I phrased my words, because people would take that and say, oh, I want the boss to be happy, and they would go and act on things that I just wanted information, or I didn't understand, I wanted to understand. And they would be acting on things that I still didn't understand, because that's what they thought I wanted to do. So I had to be real careful what I said. When we were in a group, I'd get the group together and we would be talking about problems. I always tried to talk last, because otherwise I didn't get what people thought. What I got was what they thought I wanted to hear. Because if I spoke first, then they did things that attached to what I said rather than what was in their head. And so I spoke last. Because I understood how powerful my words could be. How much more powerful are God's words when God gives you a suggestion? When God says, I think you should do this. Is that fairly powerful? Yeah. He might not say, I order you to go and do this. He just says, yeah, this is what I think you should do. But it carries with it, like my words, the full weight of the creator of the universe, right? So, what were some of God's words in Genesis that are, I'm calling law? Let's see. laws started at creation were spoken by God. Okay. Here's some of the laws that were given in Genesis. Sometimes I've heard people say, Adam and Eve were only given one command: don't eat of the tree in the middle of the garden. No, that's not true. They were told long before that, be fruitful and multiply. What does that sound like? I want my creation to continue, and you are part of my creation, and when you multiply, my creation multiplies. And I want you to go and do that. That was the instruction to Adam and Eve. Now, I've often puzzled. How long between all of this and eating of the tree? Because we don't get any record of children until after the garden they're booted out. But that's the record of the children after the garden. Were there children in the garden because they were told to be fruitful and multiply, and were they not doing it? Or did this happen really, really fast? I don't know. It's a puzzle for me. There's another thing in there that a lot of people today don't like. They were told to subdue all of creation. Have dominion over it. Subdue it and have dominion over it. I've put you here, and I've put you in charge. And I want you to take charge. Well, that's not how it's supposed to be. No, that's what God told them. I've made creation, and I've put you here, and you are now in charge of it. Take care of it. Subdue it, have dominion over it, and all the beasts of the field, and all of the birds of the air. It's very specific. You should be doing that. When we talk about people who are concerned about the environment, I think that that's still applicable today. I'm not sure that always the methodologies are the same and the interests are the same, but that's, I think, still good information for us today. God said that that was the purpose of man, and last I checked, we're people. So that might still apply to us. Tend the garden. Well, we don't have to do that because we're not in that garden, but the garden was going to require work. And there was someone assigned to do that work, and that was Adam and Eve. Your job is to tend the garden. Anybody here ever had a garden? Does it grow all by itself? Sure. Does it grow well if you do nothing? No. It requires work. And I don't know how big the garden was, but it seems like it was a fairly big place. Might have required a lot of tending. And then, of course, in Genesis 2:15 and 3:3, because I throw in 3:3 because I've heard people say, well, Adam was told not to eat of the tree, but Eve knew it because she told the serpent. Oh no, we are not. She knew the rule. She knew the law. All right. So these were all laws for the first family. I know that sounds odd with our term first family being president. No, the first family was Adam. And so along with law came sin and consequences. The beginning of sin and consequences is in Genesis. Adam and Eve ate of the tree. That was a sin. There was consequences. They were removed from the garden and not allowed to go back in. What we call the law of natural consequences. The tree in the garden that allows you to live forever, you can't go to anymore. Because along in the middle of the tree was also the tree of life, right? And you don't get to eat that tree anymore, and now you're going to die because you don't get to eat the tree of life anymore. Natural consequences. Later, they have kids, and their kids offer sacrifices to God, and one offered good and one offered bad. One offered a good sacrifice, one offered a bad sacrifice. And they received good and bad from God. Probably offering a bad sacrifice to God would be sinful. Knowing that what I'm offering is bad, or it's not what he wants, it's not what he's asked for, you probably put that in the bad box. Were there consequences? Yep. God wasn't happy with the one that wasn't doing the right thing. Happy with the one doing the right thing, unhappy with the one doing the wrong thing. Cain murdered his brother over this. God likes you best, so I'll kill you, and then he'll have to like me better because you won't be here. Yeah. No. Were there consequences for Cain? What were some of those consequences of Cain? And we talk about the mark of Cain. God put a mark on him. Because he was bad? No. So that everybody would else know that they can't harm Cain because I'm harming Cain, and they're not supposed to, or else they get Cain's punishment. Go back and read what the mark of Cain was. It was so that other people would recognize that if they harmed Cain, that they basically took his place. I think I'll leave Cain alone. I'll leave that between him and God. That might be an interesting concept for us today. Our sin is between us and God, not you and me and God. I get to help you with your sin and God because you need my help. No, it's between you and God. And that's probably where we should allow it to stay, is between them and God. And we can help them, but I think we should be really careful about that. Also, if you remember, Cain was a farmer. And God said, the ground's not going to bear fruit for you anymore. You're not going to be able to be a farmer anymore. I know that's what you like to do, but you don't get to do that anymore. Now when you plant things, you're going to get thorns. I think blackberries, because up here, that's... Anybody have problems with blackberries? Yeah. They're wonderful to eat. Not so wonderful when they are as tall as the garage. Sin and consequences, right? Has that changed today? Is that law of sin and consequences still in effect? Yeah, it is. Because a lot of the laws that we're going to read about in Genesis are what I call natural laws like gravity. It just is. We also find out that there were people in Genesis that tried to do what God wanted. Enoch was one of those. And we have an interesting saying in Enoch. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. There's lots of stories that try to make this more real for you. Methuselah was the oldest man who ever lived, but died before his father because he didn't die. God took him. They tell this. One preacher would tell the story of, Enoch walked with God, and one day God said, Enoch, you're closer to my place than yours. Why don't you just come live with me now? And then they walked on to God's place instead of back to Enoch's place. I'm not sure that's exactly how it happened, but it's a good picture, and I think it's. But isn't that what we have all been called to do? Walk with God. And at some point, God will take us. That's always been the plan. Before Abraham, that was the plan. Walk with God and be with God. Do you remember what the saying was about Adam and Eve in the garden? And God walked with them in the garden? Hasn't that always been the plan for us to walk with God? Genesis seems to indicate, yep, that was always the plan. And all of the rest of the things that we will look at throughout Scriptures point back to, that's still the plan. That's still the desire of God, that you walk with Him. Get to have that relationship with Him. Following the garden, sin grows to the point that God regrets making man, and the consequences is the great flood. We have great sin and we have great flood. Sin and consequences. But Noah, like Enoch, found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So not everybody was bad, but just about. Just about. This sin and consequences is repeated throughout the entire biblical record. You find that in the New Testament? Yep. You find that in all of the Old Testament? Yep. It's always there. This is kind of my own saying that Genesis, we have the beginning of the saints. And you go, no, saints are a New Testament thing. Yeah, they are. But what does the term saint really mean? Those who are set apart. The patriarchs, by the way, were saints. They were set apart for God's purpose. Now, that was Hebrew, and New Testament's where we get hagios or saints. But, you know, the number one translation of that is separate from the common condition in use. They used to take vessels and set them apart. Well, God said, yep, just like you set apart those vessels for important things, I am setting you apart, and you apart, and you apart for special things. That's what makes you a saint, because God has set you apart. And notice that it then became a common term for members of the first Christian communities. Did we say we want to be like the first church? Then we want to be set apart. Their term for themselves. So the patriarchs are the story of the patriarchs are the story of God setting individuals apart for His purpose, for working His will and His plan on the rest of history. Pretty important to note, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they were not perfect. We tell a lot of children's stories to them, but sometimes we try and omit the parts that are not nearly as nice, because there were some times that they weren't nice. In fact, I always say Jacob was a rascal. He wasn't very nice at all. In fact, he wasn't very nice for a really long time. Go back and read the story of Jacob. It's a long time before he becomes nice. That's his story. And God says, yep, but I have a plan for you, Jacob, so it's okay. You'll figure it out soon enough. Any of us ever not nice? Yeah. Do you know God still has a plan for you? And sometimes, if I learn nothing else from the Old Testament and from the story of the patriarchs, God doesn't work on my time. God works on His time. And sometimes I'm impatient. God is really patient. And it's a good thing, because that means He's patient with me, because He needs to be, because I'm slow. Right? We all, I remember in a class, Bill saying, I don't want justice, I want mercy. Right? I want God to be patient with me. Think about it. Are we supposed to be set apart today? Yeah. And what's that look like? Remember I said at the beginning, we're going to be talking about what is our vision for the future? How are we going to be set apart in a community that we live in now? And how are we going to impact that community? What does that look like? What are reasonable things for us to do to affect the community that we live in, both here and out there? There's a second beginning, new beginning in Genesis. There's a new beginning with Noah. We just said that God didn't like it, Noah and the big flood. So, for those of you who like math, you can count on your fingers and toes as I go through this, and then I'll add it up for you at the end. But we're told Noah lived 350 years post-flood. 350 years after the flood. Okay? It's a long time. Aren't you glad we're not living 350 years after we get old? Because he was 600 at the flood, So 350 after the flood. A third of his life. Maybe a little more. Now Shem, one of his children. We're only going to look at one of his children, and it will become clear why. One of his children, Shem, had Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Arpachshad had Shelah 35 years after he was born. And Shelah had Eber 30 years after he was born. And Eber had Peleg 34 years after he was born. Now, we're stopping here because, one, I ran out of room on the page. We're at 101 years. Noah's still got 249 years to go. Peleg may be important. Kind of keep Peleg in the back of your mind. At 100 years. We're going to round it off to 100 years. Peleg, after 30 years, had Ru. Ru, after 32 years, had Serug. Serug, after 30 years, had Nahor. Nahor, after 29 years, had Terah. And Terah, it says, after 70 years, had Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And that's how it says it. I don't know if they were triplets or if it just says, yeah, he had 3 kids by the time he was 70, and here's their names. But by the time Terah was 70, Abram is born. Now, for those of you who've pulled off your shoes and have been counting on your toes, we're still not to 350. So when Abram is born, what does that mean? Noah's still alive when Abram is born. Beginning of a new relationship in a new nation. God's got a plan. So, Abram arrives 292 years after the flood, which means he's alive 58 years with Noah alive. 17 years later, Abraham turns 75 after Noah dies, and he is called. Almost everybody else on that list of names that I read would still be alive when when Abraham gets the call. All of those people, all of those below Noah, are still alive when Abraham gets the call. And a lot of them are still alive when Isaac is born. So imagine when Noah is 50, like I say, everyone is there. But there's another thing. Everyone alive when Abraham is 50 can trace their lineage back to Noah. There isn't anybody else. There is no other line. Everybody alive when Abraham is 50 can say, yep, Noah, I belong to him. Everyone. That's almost a new Adam, right? Because everybody else is gone. There's another story that's interspersed in there. To Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg. Remember we said Peleg at about 100 years? For in his days the earth was divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. The earth was divided. And right after that, we have chapter 11. And the story of the Tower of Babel. So if Peleg was named because the earth was divided, and that is Babel, that would be 100 years after the flood, we have the Tower of Babel and all of the languages being mixed up. And Noah's still got 250 years to live. And it means maybe his three sons all now speak different languages. And it's very clear in the biblical account, these are the lists of the children and their nationalities and their languages that they speak. It seems pretty clear that that's how it got divided up. But again, Noah is still getting to see all of this. Now think of this story, that just this part that we've talked about so far, in context of the people who were alive then. They all had God stories. They had multi-God stories. Most ancient civilizations have some kind of flood story. Doesn't align necessarily with the biblical one, but they all have one. There was a big flood. And that was handed down for years and years. What sets the Genesis account apart? You have a God who wants to have a relationship, and a loving God versus an idiosyncratic God. Beginning of God's promise, that comes with Abraham. Abraham receives multiple promises concerning him, his family, his inheritance, and his impact on the future of all people. And the story of Abraham covers another 10 chapters. It's as long as creation, 10 chapters, 20% of the book. But the promises of Abraham go back to Noah too. After the incident with Noah getting drunk and his sons, and they walk back, two of them walk backward and cover him, he blesses two of his sons. And one of them, he says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem." By the way, remember we went down from Shem down to Abram? "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan," the son of Ham that pointed out to his brothers how he found Dad, let Canaan, is Canaan going to be important in the rest of Genesis? Let Canaan be his servant. The promises of Abraham actually go back to the promises or the prophecy of Noah. We're going to spend a lot of time on this, but you recall some of those promises that Abraham had for him. Great nation, wealth, I will be your God. And then there were some promises, and in the future there's going to be something really special come from you. And that's for us. Then we have Joseph. Isaac, the child of promise. The child that Abraham has at 100 years old, 25 years after God says you're going to have a child, right? Or the barren will conceive. He gets just a couple of eventful chapters, and we don't hear anything else about him until he dies. Isaac is very important for like 2 chapters. The child of promise is important for 2 chapters, and then we don't see him again until he dies. And then it's oh, by the way, and now he died and he was buried. We think, well, he should be like front center stage. No, not so much. His son Jacob gets 20 of the 50 chapters. And Jacob's son Joseph shares many of those chapters and is covered by 20 chapters. That's 40% of the book is covered by Jacob and Joseph, each. They each get about 20 chapters. Abraham is the father of the nation, and the Jews make a big deal about that. But the book gives twice as much coverage to Jacob, who becomes Israel, which seems important, and Joseph. So which did God seem to think was most important? I think the coming of the nation that I'm going to have a special relationship with and that I have special promise with. I point out Joseph is one of the few biblical characters without a glaring sin story. You know, David and Bathsheba, Jacob is a scoundrel his whole life. Abraham tries to help God out. What's the bad story about Joseph? I don't know one. I'm hearing Logan laugh. I don't know one. Oh, because he lived such a great life, then he must have had a wonderful life that was full of ease. Is that how it worked? Ben?
I was going to say, there is one glaring thing about Joseph, is how he treats his brothers after they come to Egypt.
How could he have treated them, being second only to Pharaoh? He tricks them, but he's trying to figure out, well, now what do I do? I always said that the biggest failing of him was when he was, 12. He thought his dreams were really cool and said, y'all are all going to bow down to me, ha-ha. And he's a little haughty, but he's just saying what God said. Now, but that's as close as I could come. Remember all those promises to Abraham? And we find out that when Israel goes to Egypt to join Joseph, that great nation has 70 people. The promises to Abraham aren't there yet. There's only 70 of them. I will create from you a great nation. Oh, 70, that's a great nation. That's not even a small town. But stay tuned, because Exodus, we find out that a lot of those things are suddenly going to become fulfilled, right? It's suddenly going to be, we went from 70 to 2 million. Conclusions. Oh, that wasn't very good. Conclusions are, God has a plan. He's always had a plan. He's okay with new beginnings happening all the time. Isn't that what baptism is, a new beginning? And that God keeps his promises in his time. Not my time, not your time, in his time. So I thank you for your time, and I forget, who's doing Exodus? Carrie. Carrie will be here next week, and he has 40 minutes to cover the entire Exodus. So thank you for your participation, and we'll be back with you in a few minutes as we do announcements for services.